So good evening, everybody. My name is Kasser Ahmed. I'm currently a vice principal in the secondary panel with the Toronto District School Board. And welcome to join the conversation session with Dr. Jasmin Zine. She is the author of Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And the topic of, sorry, can we go back one slide? And the topic for tonight will be Islamophobia and its impact on Muslims and Muslim youth. Let's begin with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
I'd also like to extend my thanks and appreciation to everyone who's joined us tonight. Let me begin by thanking you, Jasmin and Doctor, for being with us. And my name is Michelle Monroe. For those who don't know me, I am the Central Coordinator for Parent and Community Engagement with the TDSB. I just want to go briefly through just some quick etiquette for our conversation this evening. No recording, pictures, or screen capturing. Please ensure that you are muted unless you are speaking. Please share your questions in the Q&A. That's where we will be fielding them from later. We're asking you that you're able to chat with our hosts throughout, and live transcriptions have been enabled for you. Just also right before we get started, in ensuring that we create a healthy, open, safe space for our conversations. Next slide, please, Margaret. Within the conversation series, we always like to quickly just outline guidelines for our conversation. These are borrowed from the 4 agreements outlined by Singleton and Hayes, and they're quickly and brief. We ask that you stay engaged. That just simply means emotionally that you are here and that you're paying a particular attention and participating, that you experience discomfort. When we have varying conversations, we always want to be sure that we are being open and willing to learn, and learning at times may require us to step out of our comfort zone, because we know that we're comfortable in our comfort zone, but things don't always grow there. And we're always want to ensure that every dialogue we're in and that we leave that growth always occurs. We want you to speak your truth. But please keep in mind that's your truth, and that your truth can only be yours, and it can be presented only if it does not create harm for someone else in terms of their ability to feel safe in the space and to speak their truth. Dialogue requires us to be open to hearing all perspectives and views in a way that's respectful but does not do harm. And please expect and accept non-closure. We host these conversations for our learning and for our growth, and that means we will not walk away with everything this evening, but you will get just enough to give you what you need to be able to continue your growth, your learning, and your understanding. So what is the conversation series? I always just want to give an overview of that. It's a platform for modeling a form of engagement that enriches public discussion on a range of topics within TDSB. These topics come from our parents and caregivers, and as we hear, we try to offer it. I just want to acknowledge the Ministry of Education, who supports and has been supporting the conversation series for the last three years or so. It's a space for parents and caregivers, staff, and the community to come together, talk, listen, share knowledge, and grow. Just a great quote I love: conversation is the creative tension that can shift and transform change for individuals, organizations, and communities. And in our board, we always want to ensure we're providing space for parents and caregivers to do just this. And we're excited because we're able to bring in just some really exceptional speakers throughout our series.
So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jasmin Zine. She's a professor of sociology, religion and culture, and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Dr. Jasmin Zine is a professor of just repeated that, my apologies. She is author of the book Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, and has authored a forthcoming report on Canada's Islamophobia industry that examines organized networks of anti-Muslim bigotry. Dr. Zine is co-founder of the International Islamophobia Studies Research Association And without further delay, over to Dr. Jasmin Zine.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for welcoming me here today. Thank you so much to everyone who's in attendance. I'd like to begin by offering you a greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. And to any of the Muslim parents and families listening, I wish you a Ramadan Mubarak. And so very pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you about some issues related to Islamophobia, its impact on Muslims and Muslim youth and children in particular. And it's really wonderful to be able to engage with parents on these questions, since you are the first teachers of your own children, and what you impart to them will stay with them their whole life. And so hopefully this dialogue will help in shedding some light on important issues related to Islamophobia. I'm going to just share my screen, so I have some slides to go through with you. I hope everyone can see that okay. And this image is a bit graphic, and I do want to say that, you know, a lot of the topics that I'm going to be discussing with you today are going to take us to places where we will be looking at what the kind of trauma of anti-Muslim racism is on different Muslim students, and some issues that might be triggering, and some issues that can be a little heavy to deal with, but we'll also end in a place where we can talk about ways forward, and we can talk about allyship and how we can all work against this particular form of oppression. So I'm going to start today by talking about what Islamophobia is and how it's manifest, so that we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to speak about the impact of Islamophobia on Muslim youth. And that is where I think a lot of the issues that I'm going to be raising, you know, are going to be coming from the youth themselves and their experiences, and hopefully give some insight into how they are faring when it comes to dealing with Islamophobia. And then looking at some positive representation of Muslims in children's books and popular culture, and the work of Muslim youth storytellers, and what it means to be an ally. So trying to look at some of the ways in which we can move forward in addressing Islamophobia, as well as talking about what it is and how it affects Muslim communities. So as mentioned in the introduction, I have a new book called Under Siege: Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And it's an exploration of how this generation, this millennial generation of Canadian Muslim youth, navigate a world where there was heightened Islamophobia during times of war and terror. And so what brought me to this particular study was, you know, at the time, right after the 9/11 attacks, I am a parent. My kids were both in Islamic school, and one was in a public school here in Toronto at the TDSB. And I remember it was a very catalytic time, because even when we didn't know who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, I remember watching television at 10 a.m. that morning and seeing the Twin Towers falling. But and it was a horrible and tragic incident, and it was very difficult to watch. But not long after, my thoughts turned to the fact that one of my children was in an Islamic school nearby. And I had known that even prior to 9/11, that Islamic schools and mosques and other institutions were subject to getting death threats. Whenever anything would happen in the world that may or may not have had something to do with Muslims, there were always these death threats. And particularly because our Islamic school was adjacent to a mosque, there were we had a lot of concerns as parents that, you know, our children might not be safe. So I remember driving there to pick up my son, and when we arrived, many men from the community had gathered out in front and kind of linked arms to kind of protect as a security perimeter around the school and the mosque. And so there was almost an immediate sense of repercussion and backlash, even before knowing, you know, what had happened with those terrible attacks. And so with my other son, he was in public school, and he was in middle school at the time, and his name is Osama. And so he was dealing with a lot of bullying, harassment, getting, death threats in his, put in his locker, notes and things, physical assault and all of, that sort of repercussion that he was facing. So seeing my own sons growing up at a time where their identities, their faith were being vilified because of the actions of, some people who happen to, share the same faith, but that they were, and we were all dealing with those repercussions. I remember shortly after that the TDSB held some forums for Muslim families and parents to come, and I was taking part in those forums and helping to facilitate some of the roundtable discussions with parents. And it was really hard to hear some of the harassment that even parents were experiencing, particularly moms who were wearing hijab or the headscarf. When they would take their kids to school, they were reporting that when they would cross the street, cars would speed up, and it would seem as though they were going to be hit by a car, or there were people throwing stones, all sorts of hate type incidents that were happening. And, talking about these in a forum where we could hear from parents and hear what their children were experiencing was one of the things that prompted me to begin to look at Islamophobia, from an academic perspective, from the perspective of an educator, and to really start to develop some tools to try and name it and address it. And so that was part of what prompted me to then do this research that examined the 9/11 generation, this generation that was growing up in a world that was quite different than it was before, and that were being socialized into conditions that they really didn't know much of a world before. But now all of a sudden their identities were under siege, and they were being cast as potential radicals or extremists, and they had to deal with that labeling. And so my book begins to examine what that experience was like for them. Now, Islamophobia has since had very deadly consequences in this country. On January 29th, 2017, a white nationalist, a student at the University of Laval in Quebec, walked into a mosque. He was a white nationalist and he was armed, and he shot dead 6 Muslim men after their evening prayers. 4 years later, last year, June 6th, 2021, on a summer evening during the pandemic, the Afzal family, a Pakistani Muslim family, were out for a walk when they were intentionally mowed down by a truck that was driven by also someone who claimed affiliation to white nationalism. And 4 members of that family, representing 3 generations of their family, were tragically killed in London, Ontario. And so we've had 2 deadly attacks of mass violence against Muslims in this country. And that is an important reason that we begin to try and understand Islamophobia, what it is, how it's manifested, and ways that we can address it, because it has been elevated to an issue that is critically important in our nation, as well as it is globally. There are many global manifestations of Islamophobia as well. So it's important to recognize the planetary reach that this phenomenon has. So I want to begin just by talking about, what is Islamophobia? And unlike what the name suggests a fear or phobia of Islam. That is not what Islamophobia is about. It is not an irrational fear or even hatred of Islam in and of itself. It refers to demonizing Muslims, or in fact, anyone who is perceived to be Muslim. And it has racist foundations. Now, when I say that it affects anyone perceived to be Muslim, let's remember back after the tragic events of 9/11, the first person who was shot and killed in reprisal for those attacks was in fact a Sikh man who was wearing a turban. He was in New York City and he was shot while he was at a gas station. He was misperceived to be Muslim because he had, brown skin and was wearing a turban. So anyone who's perceived to be a Muslim can also be victim of Islamophobia. And so it also doesn't mean that you cannot be critical of Islam as you would be any other religion. It's fair game to be critical of religions. But the difference is that this evolves into demonizing and vilifying Muslims. And so that is what Islamophobia is about. It's not just an irrational fear. In fact, that fear has been very much rooted in sort of a long legacy of racist ideas about Islam and Muslims. And it is the phenomenon where hate and bigotry are translated into individual actions, negative ideas and stereotypes that then find expression in laws and policy. And so I'm going to explain a little bit more how that works, but that is just to give you an idea of what Islamophobia is as a form of oppression and as a type of racism. But Islamophobia is also intersectional, meaning that Muslims are diverse. There's over 1.5 billion Muslims across the world who represent different sectarian orientations within the faith, who represent many different ethno-racial backgrounds, many geographical, national contexts. So Islam is very diverse. Part of what Islamophobia does is sort of flatten those distinctions. So it makes Islam and Muslims seem very monolithic, which they're not. And so because of that diversity, Islamophobia is lived differently according to the specific social identities of Muslims, right? There's, Islamophobia is lived differently depending on, for example, if you're a Muslim woman, then Islamophobia is going to affect you in different ways. Muslim women, particularly who are more visibly marked, who wear a headscarf or who wear a niqab, which is a face veil, are going to face the brunt of discrimination and discriminatory acts, hate crimes, simply because they are more visibly marked, and also are subject to laws and policies to regulate their religious attire. For example, in Quebec, with Bill 21, religious symbols such as the hijab or niqab are not allowed in the public sphere. So Muslim women who are teachers, judges, who are working in any capacity within the state in public office cannot wear hijab or niqab. And so this regulation of Muslim women's bodies is something that we see in many nations, not only here, but in Europe, in terms of regulating what they can and cannot wear. And so that is one of the manifestations of a kind of gendered Islamophobia. But part of Islamophobia is that it is part of a tapestry of racisms as well. It incorporates anti-Arab racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Brown racism. And so the histories of those different forms of racism also converge and are impacted by Islamophobia, where it adds another layer to those particular kinds of oppression. So I just wanted to make it clear that Islamophobia is something that is experienced and lived differently. So just to kind of illustrate a little more visually the dynamics of Islamophobia, so we get a sense of how it works or how other kinds of oppression work, is to say that, if we look at it like an iceberg, at the tip of the iceberg, we may see certain individual actions that if we would say, okay, yes, that was something that was Islamophobic, that was said or done or occurred. But what's below the surface are negative ideas, stereotypes. And those ideas and stereotypes are often what inspire those actions that we see above the water at the tip of the iceberg. And they kind of rationalize and justify why it's okay to discriminate against this particular group. And also below the surface, what we don't see are the systems in society within which Islamophobia, like other forms of oppression, become part of. They become expressed in education and social services and healthcare, law, governmental policies. So it's the best way to understand Islamophobia is through this kind of a dynamic. So we realize it's manifest in individual ways. It's also manifest through stereotypes and negative ideas that we get from media, from film, television, from sitting around a dinner table and, having people who have these negative ideas share them, hearing them, in other spaces. And they also are manifest through the kinds of systems in society that also are regulating expressions of Muslimness or are targeting Muslims. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. So just to go to that tip of the iceberg and talking about some of the individual kinds of manifestations of Islamophobia, this can be anything from, microaggressions to hate crimes. It spans that range. It can be physical and sexual harassment, violence, exclusion, vandalism. Some of the images here give you a little bit of a sense of that. Right in the center, what you kind of see over here is a pig's head wrapped in cellophane that was dropped at the door of the mosque in Quebec where the Quebec mosque shooting happened a year before the attack took place. And it has a card on it that says Bon Appetit. And it also has blue and white ribbons, bows, which are the colors of the Quebec flag. And so what this gruesome, act was meant to communicate was an unwelcomeness to Muslims, because Muslims don't eat pork. The pig is used often as this way of being very derogatory toward Muslims and showing them that they are not welcome. And so this pig's head had been left as this sort of gruesome hate crime a year before the attacks took place. We also saw, after the London terror attack, 3 Black Muslim women were attacked within a span of a week in Edmonton. And so one of the things we see is after these sort of horrific terror attacks is that there's actually an uptick in other kinds of violent actions against Muslims. For example, also this mosque in Edmonton with a swastika that was spray painted on it. And this is an earlier image, but the image of a Muslim woman who was running for, I think it was a city councillor, and her posters were defaced and "Go Home" was written on it. And so these are all symbols and signs of how individual actions of Islamophobia are being are represented and are targeting Muslim communities across the country. There's also what's below the water, below the surface, that I said was really important also, which are the stereotypes, the ideas that kind of justify those actions or make people rationalize those kinds of actions. And so what would make someone want to do something like vandalize a mosque are some of these kinds of ideas, that Muslims are terrorists and are a danger to society. That's a dominant stereotype, that Muslim women are oppressed, that Muslims want to impose, Sharia law in Canada and force Canadians to be subject to that, and that Muslims don't accept Canadian values. Those are some of the ideas, the stereotypes, that exist about Muslims in Canada, and those false ideas are what inspire often other kinds of acts of hate at the tip of that iceberg. And they're often expressed more often now through conspiracy theories. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that are circulating through social media, and ideas that Muslims are like a Trojan horse that, have come to secretly take over society. They're really wolves in sheep's clothing. They're the enemies within, or the fifth column. And there's many, many other conspiracy theories that are circulating globally that reinforce these negative ideas about Muslims. But those ideas aren't just only in conspiracy theories. If we look at some of the public opinion polls in Canada, over the last several years, and in fact, my research team has looked at them since about 2004 to present, this is just some of the examples of what Canadians think about their Muslim neighbors and friends and community. For example, in 2017, a Radio Canada poll found that nearly 1 out of 4 Canadians would favor a ban on Muslim immigration to Canada. And in Quebec, that support went up to 32%. So this poll was taken after Donald Trump was elected, and his first official act or executive order was to initiate what was called a Muslim ban in the United States. And so when this poll was taken, it was sort of checking the temperature in Canada to see, well, how many people would approve of such a move in Canada. And it was also taken after the Quebec mosque attack in 2017. So it is troubling to see that almost a quarter of Canadians supported this idea. The same poll also revealed that 51% in Canada, 57% in Quebec, felt that the presence of Muslims in this country made them somewhat or very worried about security. On March 25th, another poll, earlier poll, was found that 68% of Canadians disagreed with allowing Muslim women to wear the niqab or the burqa during citizenship swearing-in ceremonies, and 72% agreed that those were symbols of oppression and rooted in a culture that is anti-woman. And so these are also dominant ideas of gendered Islamophobia, where Muslim women are regarded, if they choose to wear Islamic dress, are regarded as being backward and oppressed and subservient to patriarchal religion, whereas most women who wear the hijab or the niqab do so of their own choosing and find it as an expression of their faith and identity. And an earlier survey in 2012 found that Canadian attitudes towards religion and multiculturalism, 52% of Canadians actually said that they distrusted Muslims, and 42% believe that discrimination against Muslims is pretty much their own fault. And so these are disturbing findings in what we see around public opinion about Muslims in this country, that they're threats to security, that they represent backward cultures, that there's a lot of victim blaming, that if they're oppressed, it's their fault. And there are some Canadians, even favoring this ban on Muslims. So this gives us a sense of the larger landscape in Canada when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. So finally, looking at these systemic factors, so the ways in which those negative ideas are then sort of translated into public policies and laws and practices, things like racial profiling, religious profiling, whether that's in communities, whether that's at the border when you travel, this idea of flying while Muslim, which is like driving while Black, these ideas that, Muslims have to be, are the subject of security concern when they're at borders. There was a no-fly list in Canada, which had a lot of Muslim names on it, including the names of Muslim toddlers. So, we see how far this goes. So various kinds of security policies, as well as bans on religious attire, as I've mentioned in Quebec's Bill 21. The Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which seemed to reference a connection between Islam and barbarism, discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, education, and social services. So pretty much all walks of life are going to be impacted by Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. Islamophobia is also organized. My current research is looking at Islamophobia industries. And what's significant about that and about Islamophobia as a form of oppression is that there's actually organized networks that are funded behind its promotion. And so these networks are made up of different groups, special interest groups, media outlets, that are there to create anti-Muslim bigotry. And they are often funded to create these forums and campaigns. So in an example here, in 2017 at the Peel District School Board, an organized network of protesters representing different special interest groups disrupted a meeting about religious accommodation by ripping pages out of a Quran and shouting Islamophobic obscenities. The main organizer shouted, will they start blowing you up? Will they rape your wife? What about when they rape your daughter? So I apologize for the graphic language there, but I thought it's important for you to see the extent to which these organized networks go in disrupting places like school boards you know, when to make these sort of claims and to bring this very troubling kind of language and ideas that they have, and sort of to pervade hate there. In another instance, the director of an organization called Act for Canada, which is an anti-Muslim group, said that the halal food being served in school cafeterias is being used to fund terrorism. So again, unfounded claims that are being made, and that Muslim students offering prayers in a Toronto school cafeteria, which they referred to as a mosqueteria, is another example of the special treatment Muslims receive at the expense of secularism. So a lot of the claims for religious accommodation, for, you know, having a place to pray at school, or for adapting dress codes in physical education, for example, having some halal food served in the cafeteria, are all seen in these ways of, you know, that they are imposing their religious values on society, which of course is inconsistent with our policies of religious accommodation, and that are part of the Human Rights Code and expressions of religious freedom. And so a lot of these organized Islamophobia groups are working in concert to foment these controversies and to have rallies and other kinds of events to try and promote anti-Muslim propaganda. And schools are not immune from their reach. In another instance, talking about how manufactured fear and moral panic are created around Muslims, I wanted to share with you this particular example. And this isn't a Canadian example. This is an example of the UK, something that happened in the UK. And it was dubbed the Trojan Horse Affair. And there's actually a podcast called the Trojan Horse Affair that was done through the New York Times. If you are interested in podcasting, it's a very interesting one, a popular one to listen to. But it essentially deals with the fact that back in 2013, a mysterious letter appeared on a city councillor's desk in Birmingham in the UK. And it was detailing an alleged plot by Islamist extremists to infiltrate local schools in what was called Operation Trojan Horse. So it was a rather, you know, strange letter. It was never verified, but it claimed to be outlining some sort of a plot by, you know, Islamist extremists to take over this local school district. It mentioned a specific school. It mentioned specific teachers. Many of those teachers lost their jobs, even though they have never verified where this letter came from. Anyone could have sent it. What was the significant takeaway for me in that podcast and in this particular situation was how easy it was for people to accept that this was something that was actually going to happen. It was simply a letter that had no verification, and yet it launched, you know, a series of different kinds of policies within the UK, largely. For example, the Prevent policy, which is a counterterrorism policy that after this happened became introduced, you know, in schools. And it asked teachers to identify students at risk for being drawn to terrorism. And it mainly, of course, was targeting Muslims. So what does it mean when teachers are now being recruited into the service of you know, racial profiling and religious profiling, and have to decide what students they think might become radicals, right? And it wasn't just, you know, elementary or high school teachers, which would already be problematic, but the surveillance extended to preschool teachers. So even preschool teachers were asked and had a responsibility under the Prevent duty to report toddlers who they thought might be potential radicals. So I don't know how you would determine whether, you know, a child in diapers would become an extremist, but this is what this policy was asking teachers to do, and even preschool teachers to do. You know, and all of this was launched from, you know, an incident that really had no verification, no veracity. It was investigated. Police investigated, higher levels of security investigated, and found nothing, no truth in it. Yet it began, you know, a domino effect of all of these particularly draconian policies. And it became more bizarre and outrageous in an incident where a Muslim child a young child in elementary school who was quite young, was trying to say the word cucumber, but was thought to be saying cooker bomb. And that ended up having their family, investigated by law enforcement, because they thought this child was saying, cooker bomb when he were really trying to say cucumber. So there's something that is lost in the innocence for Muslim youth, where if they are always going to be seen under this veil of suspicion, even from when they are toddlers, there should be a lot of concern as to how this affects Muslim children and youth, and to what extent that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy down the road. So these are the kinds of conditions through which young Muslim children are being socialized and having to address the rest of society, how they're being labeled and seen by others. This is another example, and I think maybe it might be a little more, you may remember this one example. This was in, I think it was, 2015. And this is in the United States. This is a young boy, I think he was 11 years old, named Ahmed. He became dubbed Ahmed the Clock Boy because he built a clock, which you can see in the up here in the photo. But when he brought it to school, the teacher thought it was a bomb. And as you can see in this very troubling image, he was arrested. He was put in handcuffs in the office of the school. The police were called in. And all he was trying to do was a science experiment. He wanted to impress his teacher. He loved science. And he was very excited to bring this to school and show his teacher that he had built something, he'd researched it. And, being a Muslim, the first thought was, oh, he must have created a bomb. So you can see how Muslim childhood is disrupted by those negative stereotypes, by the kind of surveillance that Muslims are placed under, and subject to this unwarranted kind of scrutiny. The one sort of saving grace here was the fact that when, at the time, President Obama heard about the case, he put out a tweet where he said, "Cool clock, Ahmed, want to bring it to the White House. We should inspire more kids like you to like science. It's what makes America great." And so this story to me always stuck out as just a reminder of, the way that Muslim children, even their identities are policed, and they are always presumed to be up to no good. Anything innocent that they may be doing, anything good, is viewed through this prism where they could be potential radicals or threats to public safety. So that does impact Muslim youth and children in very destructive ways. Unfortunately, the family here ended up leaving the United States and moving to Qatar. So it wasn't necessarily a happy ending to this story, but this image of this young boy handcuffed always is very shocking and disturbing to me, and I'm sure to everyone. So what I've been trying to demonstrate are some of the ways that society has been labeling Muslim communities and labeling Muslim youth, and how they have to deal with the weight and the burden of those labels, much like this image where, you've got all of these sort of stereotypes that are mapped onto your body that, other people are imposing on you, that have little to do with who you are, how you see your identity, how you see your faith, how you see your place in the world. And when you're coming of age at a time where you are faced with these burdens and these external kinds of labeling that you have to address, it's a very, it can be very devastating to your psyche, and it can be a real problem in terms of how you begin to see yourself and your community and your own identity. And so here's some quotes of some of the participants in my study. My study involved interviewing Muslim youth across Canada. I interviewed 130 Muslim youth from New Brunswick to BC, and asked them about their experiences, sort of after 9/11, and how they were dealing with this heightened Islamophobia that was affecting them in all aspects of their lives, and how they were starting to see themselves and how they were coping and navigating all of this. So one of the students I spoke to said that I guess this is Secundar, who says, I guess the single biggest negative impact was that the mainstream majority now probably suspects every other young Muslim male with a basketball jersey or having an engineering degree to be a potential truck bomber. And so, this is part of how these youth have been impacted, in that they're pretty sure other people are, thinking that they may be up to no good, that they may be, if they even have an engineering degree, that makes them suspect. Are they going to be plotting some kind of an attack? So they are very aware of how their identities and their bodies are being read by others. And another Pakistani youth here, Zahir, says that if you're white, you're simply an individual and you're separate from the rest of society. Whereas if you're a Muslim, you're linked to the whole community. And concerning Islamophobia, it's a daily thing. A lot of work needs to be done to have accurate reporting in the media and to have Canadians at large understand that Muslims are not terrorists blowing each other up or wife beaters. So these young Muslims are very aware of the kinds of stereotypes, the different sorts of stereotypes that exist about their identities and who they are. And they realize that, they're not seen as individuals. They're seen as part of a collective that is labeled in a negative and pejorative way. That it's very hard for them to have an individual identity and be seen outside of those negative stereotypes, that those stereotypes have become this container that kind of consumes them, and it's hard to be seen as an individual. This is a scenario about the collective guilt and responsibility that was imposed on all Muslims as a result of the 9/11 attacks. And I mean, it continues to this day, 20 years later. But this is a student in Ontario, Rania, who was of Egyptian background, who was remembering what happened when she was in school during the attacks. And she says, the day of September 11th, we were watching the Twin Towers falling. And this was happening in school. And she said, and I remember my grade 7 world cultures teacher came and pointed her finger in my face and said, tell your people to stop attacking Americans. I was a very sarcastic child, and I was always made fun of because I wore hijab since grade 3. So as my defense mechanism, I wouldn't cry. I would always just say something sarcastic. So I remember I was really on the defensive because I was very emotional, and I was like, okay, hand me a phone and I'll call my uncle bin Laden. And so she was able to use humor as a defense mechanism when she had faced so much sort of, daily forms of microaggressions and Islamophobic bigotry. And so when this day happened, she was singled out in class, and she was made to feel responsible for what was happening and to be accountable for it. And so that's part of this burden of collective guilt and responsibility that has been placed upon Muslim communities globally, but it was also felt by Muslim school children, that they were somehow responsible, complicit, or needed to account for the actions of other people that happened to be Muslim who were involved in a terror attack somewhere else. And that's something that persists. And just to share more experiences of my participants and some of the Islamophobia they were experiencing in schools. This is Mavish, who is Iranian Muslim student, and she says, I put on a religious tolerance panel after 9/11 in my grade 12 year of high school, and actually received death threats. And I was called a cult follower and a brainwasher, a liar, and all kinds of things, heretic, everything, and was basically told that I'd be condemned to hell. And so she's, sharing some traumatic experience that she had when she was actually trying to make an intervention and was trying to talk about religious tolerance and to bring people together and to have dialogues. And often I would hear a lot of experiences of the kind of emotional trauma that students would feel when they would try to, hold events and try to present other points of view or to have dialogue. And so that was another burden that a lot of young Muslims experience, that they have to deal with at a very young age. And this is just another example of Islamophobic bullying and how it negatively affects these youth. So Atika, who was in New Brunswick, said that after September 11th, things kind of got worse. My friend who I knew at school got beaten up there every other day. I got pushed into a locker. It was really hard for me to go to school for a couple of weeks because I was so embarrassed of my religion. I was scared to say that I was Muslim, so I took my hijab off. After that, I haven't worn it because it had such an effect on me. Because when someone just beats you up because of who you are, and then you think everything will be fine when you just take it off. So Atika felt that by taking off the hijab, she was removing the ammunition for people hating her. And so she had to take off part of her identity in order to feel that she could be not just accepted, but feel safe. And so this is often what happens, where some young people become estranged from their identity and their religion and distance from it because that identity is being maligned and socially devalued. And so for some young Muslim girls who chose to wear the hijab because it was a marker of their faith and fidelity, and a way that they chose to express themselves, ended up taking it off because it became a way of making them more targeted and vulnerable. I can say for myself, I wore the hijab for 17 years, and I did wear it during the time of 9/11 and its aftermath. And, I didn't leave my home for a week because of the sort of fear of reprisal and what I was hearing from within the community. And so it's always been, for me, I look at what it takes, the strength and conviction of identity for a lot of young people who are going to school and are, choosing to express their identity visibly as Muslims, and are going against this tide of Islamophobia, going against societal assumptions about them, but are still choosing to wear it. Whereas, and they become more invested in their identity because their identity is being attacked. Meanwhile, others are also becoming estranged from their identity and will start either dejabbing, taking their hijab off, or maybe anglicizing their names so that they won't be identified as Muslim and therefore won't be more as subject to harassment, bullying, and attack. And so this poses a burden of representation where, again, going back to one of the earlier comments, you're not seen as an individual, you're seen as part of a collective that is negatively labeled. And that puts a lot of burden on young people who are still trying to figure out who they are, trying to figure out their identity, where they fit in the world. How do others see me? There's already so many judgments, particularly on young women and girls who are always being judged physically. Whether or not they wear a headscarf or not, there's so much physical judgment on young girls and their bodies, and a lot of body shaming and a lot of burden that's put on them, and a sort of tyranny of beauty where you have to conform to certain societal standards or be, alienated and teased and all of these sorts of things. And so this burden of representation was expressed here by Sophia, who's a Somali student in Ontario, who said that when you're in public and you're wearing the hijab, you're extremely aware of every action you take. If you're in a bad mood and you're scowling at everybody, right? You are Muslim. It's not just me having a bad day. I'm the Muslim girl. I don't represent just myself anymore. And so a lot of youth felt that they needed to, that when they go out into the world, that they're not just representing themselves, they're representing all Muslims. So they had to be very mindful of how they were. Were they smiling? Were they giving a good impression? How were others seeing them? Because they knew that whatever they did would cast either positively or negatively on other members of their group, on other Muslims. And so this is part of that burden of representation. And that's also representative of the kind of gendered Islamophobia. And I want to talk about a case here that will also tell you something about this burden of gendered Islamophobia and its impact. And this is a case that happened in Toronto at a school back in 2008, C.W. Jeffries. And there was a tragic shooting of a young Black youth, Jordan Manners, at that school, and it launched an investigation. Now, while they were investigating what happened in that case, police found that there were Muslim girls in the school who were being subject to various kinds of sexual assault. Again, I mentioned that there would be some disturbing content here. And yet nothing had come of this. It had been reported, but nothing happened until a year later when this other investigation was happening and some of these issues came to light. What was really, I think, disturbing about this incident was the kind of, when they started to look into it, why these girls were targeted and what the assumptions about them were that led to their targeting. And so these are some quotes from a Toronto Star article that showcased this investigation. And some of the female students at the school believed that grade 9 girls were being targeted by a group of boys for being unpopular and shy. Again, these were young Muslim students. And so they were being seen as vulnerable, so they were targeted. The board asked the panel to look into the speculation that the girls were targeted because of their religion and ethnic background, which made them less likely to report abuse for fear of reprisal at home. Now, this was an assumption. This was not necessarily something that was true, but it was assumed that because these girls were Muslim, that if they actually told anyone or told their parents what would happen, they would be the ones punished, not the boys. Now, this was not in fact true, but this was, again, one of the stereotypes or one of the assumptions about Muslim families, that they would not support their daughters, they would blame their daughters. And so it was not reported because of the fear of reprisal. And the article also revealed that this one girl in particular was chosen apparently because Muslims are less likely to report it because of their strict parents and cultural taboos. Again, this assumption, this stereotype that, well, you know, they were chosen for being targeted in this way by this particular kind of sexual abuse and harassment by these boys because they didn't think they would report it, that they'd be too afraid of their families. And this brings up fear of things, you know, things like people assuming that all Muslim girls who would tell their parents that, you know, they had been hurt or assaulted would be then facing honor killing or some sort of reprisal. And so again, this is a misperception. This is a kind of stereotype that negatively affected these girls, number one, because they were chosen and targeted for this kind of harassment. And then it wasn't reported because, you know, by the school authorities, because they were afraid that it actually, the families would react negatively to that. And so this was always a very, you know, troubling example of how gendered Islamophobia, those negative stereotypes and ideas, can really impact how others perceive, you know, Muslim girls, their families and communities. And of course, it shaped this particular situation in really troubling ways. The other thing, you know, that's very significant about Muslim communities, again, as I mentioned, Muslim communities are very diverse. Some communities have been in Canada for many decades. Others are newcomers. Many are refugees. And so when we talk about refugee communities who are coming to Canada from different parts of the world, fleeing civil strife and persecution and war, they have their own unique set of issues, you know, when they are coming into new societies. And it also brings another form of trauma with it. And so I was speaking with a Black Muslim youth worker in Ottawa who saw a lot of these refugee kids and young girls in particular she was working with in the community there. And she said that the specific reality of Muslim youth is that they may be coming from a country that's being bombed. They may have been bombed themselves. They're still dealing with that trauma. There are often not a lot of spaces for them to talk about their experience, even in the Muslim community. If they're angry at America for something, there's not a lot of space to talk about that. Not even angry, if they're just scared and traumatized. They feel like they're going to die and they talk about death all the time. For those sorts of specific experiences, there needs to be space for healing. And I really, excuse me, felt this was significant in understanding the different kinds of experiences, particularly those families who are fleeing trauma and violence and persecution in their own countries, who are coming here, and then they are facing also a number of barriers here when it comes to, racism, discrimination, learning a new culture, language, way of life, so many kinds of barriers, and then still having to heal from the sort of post-traumatic stress from the situations they have left and are entering into a new set of situations that are equally traumatizing. And so I think it's really important when we talk about the experiences of marginalized vulnerable youth to recognize the different interlocking and intersecting forms of trauma that they experience, from what they may have experienced before to what they are experiencing when they resettle in Canada and face different kinds of barriers. So there's so many different kinds of trauma, and racism is also a form of trauma, and one that can scar people for their entire lives. So it's important to remember the different kinds of intersecting traumas, and especially how those impact our refugee communities, as we see more people also coming to Canada who are looking for sanctuary. Another Somali youth worker in Toronto that I spoke to was very concerned about the impact of Islamophobia and different stresses that youth in the community were facing. And she told me that, quote, "I've done a research project about Somali youth. And some of the things that came up a lot was stress factors. 13 and 14-year-olds are stressed and they're oversleeping or overeating. It's strange. They do feel different and they're picked on because of their race, religion, or culture. The relationship with depression and anxiety comes with the stress these youth are going through in grade 8 or 9. And so I think the impact and the toll that multiple stressors are placing on young people today, particularly racialized communities, of course, compounded by their other kinds of situations, whether they're also dealing with poverty and unstable housing, whether they're dealing with health issues, whether they are dealing with being newcomers, whether they have other, issues of disability. There's multiple and intersecting factors that are going to impact the mental health as well as physical health of young people. But it's this pervasive sense of stress and depression. I certainly see it in the university. When I have students in my classes, I've noticed over the last 2 decades how instances of mental health concerns have really, grown exponentially, and of course, particularly due to the pandemic as well. And so we're seeing these issues kind of carrying through and staying with people as they progress through their educational careers and through their lives. And it's important to recognize those at an early age and stage and be able to address those. And so really looking at the different factors that are going to impact health, wellness, and well-being. And any form of racism, whether it's Islamophobia or any other type of racism, is something that is definitely going to impact young people and well into their adulthood, and can manifest in different ways in terms of depression or eating disorders and other problems. So it's important to be attentive to that. And then my final example here is about how Islamophobia becomes internalized. And so, when we talk about any kind of racism, it's always about how others perceive a particular individual or group and how that group is understood in negative ways. a lot of those ideas become internalized by the people who within those groups that are being subject to racism. And they begin to see themselves through that lens. And this is an example of how Islamophobia can be internalized, and the kind of external surveillance on young Muslims becomes internalized and they become self-surveilling. So I'll explain it through this quote. So this is Yusuf who's speaking here. And he said, you know, it's not just how other people are going to see us, but how we see ourselves, like how we internalize it. Even when we were planning the MSA retreat, this is a Muslim Student Association retreat, we wanted to go into the forest and build a bonfire. But then we had to start thinking about that. And it's even kind of funny. We were joking that if someone did see all of us visibly Muslim folks there, out in the woods, all kinds of suspicion would arise. So we internalize that fear. We have to monitor what we do so it doesn't come off as suspicious, even if it's not. And so this is something I saw throughout my study, where I would ask Muslim youth, well, how did 9/11 affect you? And they would say, well, actually it didn't affect me. And I would say, oh, okay. So, well, tell me what your Muslim Student Association is doing. And they said, well, we were going to go up north and play paintball, but we didn't want to be seen as a terrorist cell. So we decided not to do that. And I thought, oh, okay, but 9/11 didn't affect you. Okay. And then they would say, we used to play these video games on our laptops, that were kind of violent, like Call of Duty, and we'd do it in the concourse of the university. But we stopped doing that because we don't want people to get the wrong idea about us, like we're violent. Oh, I would say, okay, but then 9/11 didn't affect you, And so I began to see how they would, this was part of their new normal. This was just the normal for them. Right? They really didn't understand a life before. And so for them, they didn't connect that kind of surveillance to any particular moment like 9/11. It just became part of how they live their lives, and how they have to think twice. If we go and light a fire in the woods and make a bonfire, how will people regard us doing that? Will we have the RCMP and CSIS converging on site if that happens? And certainly their fears are not paranoia, because we have Muslim student associations at the universities that are being surveilled by security communities, RCMP, and counterterrorism units. All of this are coming in and trying to talk to Muslim students who are involved in Muslim student associations. So after a while, these youth begin to become self-surveilling. How do I look suspicious? What am I carrying with me when I go on an airplane? Having to look at every action and what they're doing through how others view them, and begin to internalize that surveillance. So that's another effect of this internalized Islamophobia. So I just want to now switch and focus on some of the ways in which we start to work against this. And I want to focus on some positive things that people can do in terms of trying to work against those stereotypes and all the negative messaging that's out there that's had this detrimental effect on Muslim youth and communities. And so one of the things is to really, if you have young children, to be able to introduce them to diversity of literature, multicultural literature that's out there. And you can talk to school librarians and they can make suggestions. These are just a few that I wanted to just point out, books that were written that show the diversity of Muslim experiences. So one is written by Ibtihaj Muhammad, who's an American Olympian. And it's called The Proudest Blue, and it's about a story of hijab and family. Another one, Yo Soy Muslim, is written from the perspective of Latinx Muslims. Again, Muslims are from all walks of life. The Wise Fool tells fables from the Islamic world. And so instead of just the usual fairy tales, you can include stories from other parts of the world to kind of disrupt just the Eurocentric focus of curriculum. And then the final one was Story of Ramadan, and Ramadan is starting right now for Muslims, and this is called Yusuf's Ramadan Lantern, and it's kind of a shameless plug because it's my children's book, but it does tell the story of the significance of the Ramadan Lantern. And so these are just some examples of children's literature as a way in to try and tell alternative stories about Muslims that Muslims themselves have written. And for those of you parents who have older children, there's now lots of Muslim superheroes that are coming out. So we're starting to see different kinds of representation in popular culture. I don't know much about this universe, but children and youth can explore different Muslim archetypes versus stereotypes through the superhero comic universe. I know that Marvel Comics has one. I think she's called Dust, and it's a Muslim girl superhero. One of these images is of comes from a French, kind of looks like Batman on here, this insignia, but it's actually a French character. And so there's different examples. If you just simply go online and you type in Muslim superheroes, you will find. And so these are things, these are supports to, for young adults who are interested in, superheroes, to start to show them superheroes from different backgrounds, and at the same time are giving them new archetypes for understanding Muslims that aren't part of the long history and legacy of these negative, detrimental stereotypes. Muslim youth themselves are starting to be storytellers. They're telling their own stories. This is an example of Muslim refugee youth from Burma, from Myanmar, who are facing genocide in their country, who came to Canada and wanted to tell the story of their people, what their families went through in the genocide, and what it was like coming to Canada. And so they worked with, actually, again, a shameless plug because it was my son, Yusuf Zine, who worked with them to create a play about their experiences. And it was called I Am Rohingya, A Genocide in 4 Acts. It became a documentary, a film, and these youth were students in schools. English was not their first language. They were very shy to speak even in front of class. But after, they worked with my son and his team, they learned to act, they learned to express themselves. They got up in front of thousands of people, told, this story through a play that they helped write. And then it became part of a documentary film that went all around the world. They got to speak, they were supported by the UN. They got to speak, internationally, and brought the struggle of their community to an international stage. And I find this example so inspiring for me because, you have a group of young people here who suffered so much, but now they have been able to come here and to try and, through storytelling, do something positive for their community back home, for their community here, and to bring a global spotlight onto the plight of their people who are experiencing this genocide. And so that's one of the most inspiring things that I've come across in terms of, looking at how youth are resisting their marginality, the experiences they've had, the trauma they've had. And so I really recommend this film. If you get a chance to rent it, watch it, have your teachers show it in classrooms. It's extremely impactful. And while it talks about difficult subjects, it's also very inspiring. So that's another intervention. I was very interested in how the arts can be used as a place of resistance, and I talk about that in my book. So now I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts about anti-Islamophobia allyship and what people can do who want to be allies and who want to create a better, a more safe and inclusive society. And so we begin by checking our own biases and being reflective about, what kind of biases we may have. Where did those come from? Where did those ideas come from? Why are we harboring them? And to challenge them. And to look at inclusion when we think about parent advisory councils. Are marginalized parents being included? What might be some barriers for their participation? How can those barriers be overcome? So putting that lens of inclusion, out there to think about the experiences of others and how to break down barriers of participation, to listen and learn, to center the voices and experiences of those who are facing oppression and to learn respectfully from them. And education is key. Educating ourselves. You could speak to the school librarian, as I mentioned, about books and resources that help your family learn more about Muslim cultures and experiences. You could visit the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, which is a wonderful resource and a beautiful space. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fake news out there. So media literacy is very important. Learn how to decipher fake news from credible news sources and discuss that media literacy with your kids. Help them understand what they're seeing and to be able to discern what's real and what's false. And challenge stereotypes. Raise concerns when you encounter anti-Muslim stereotypes and challenge those. That's how you can, leverage your own privilege and be an ally, by disrupting those spaces of bigotry when you encounter them. And then finally, have a global outlook and learn more about the struggles of Muslims globally as a way of making your children aware of important current events. So even as I just mentioned, the Rohingya case in Burma, a lot of people don't even know who the Rohingya are, but there's, as much as there is tragedy there, there's inspiring stories. And those are things that you can share with your family to learn more about current events and have a broader outlook and understanding of the diversity of Muslim experiences, which aren't all negative. And we have many positive representations through some of the examples that I've given that you can share with your families. And so thank you for allowing me to share these insights and my research with you. And I look forward to addressing any questions that you have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So thank you, Margaret. You can take the slide deck off, because what we really want to do now is just open the floor and turn it over to Kasser and Nazra, who will be facilitating questions to you. So Kasser, Naz, I'll turn it over to you now. Just a gentle reminder to our audience, we're only accepting questions through the Q&A. So if you have a question, please ensure that you put it through the Q&A, and we'll try to get to many of them as we possibly can. So I'll stop taking up time and airtime, and I'll turn it over to our facilitators of questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Zine. That was such an enlightening and educative and informative presentation. And yes, the Trojan Horse is such an excellent podcast. If you haven't heard it, you definitely have to, give it a little listen. And we'll just go through some of the questions that have been posted into the chat. So maybe I'll start with one of the first ones, which is, what suggestions do you have for educators and administrators to support Muslim students in their schools?
Thank you very much for the question. I think when we talk, there's so many, it's a very rich question, because as I've tried to outline, there's so many different facets to how, excuse me, any form of oppression affects young people, their families, their communities. So when we look at what schools can do, I think, schools are an important place of socialization. Schools are an important place of, how we begin to understand ourselves and the world and those around us. And so ensuring that there are, positive representations that you've got, in your classes, that they aren't simply just examples of Eurocentric lives. One of the other things that affects marginalized young people is when they don't see themselves reflected in school and in the curriculum. This was something that affected me growing up. I'm actually a high school dropout. I don't have a high school diploma. I do have a PhD, but I don't, to this day, don't have a high school diploma. And a lot of it was because of the kinds of issues I encountered growing up, in an all-white community, and with a lot of harassment and bullying and racism, but also that school, when I went to school, I saw nothing that reflected me. And of course, I'm from a different era where, we only had, maybe Malibu Barbie was all you had, right? All of the fairy tales and stories were always about, little blonde girls. And so now, of course, there's so much more out there in terms of representation in storybooks, children's books, some of the examples I've given. So those are ways to ensure that, what's on the walls in the school represents the diversity of students in your class, that the knowledge that you are expressing includes the diversity of experiences of students there. And, that there's also space for students to, if they do have problems, that where they can go to be able to have a safe space to talk about what's going on and how things are affecting them. And, and doing professional development for teachers about Islamophobia. I know earlier Kaiser was telling me that he has a program for school administrators about Islamophobia. So that's going to be an excellent intervention that will allow them to get more knowledge and information that's specific to their roles as educators. And so I think ongoing education is very important for teachers and administrators.
100%. Thank you for that. And also I can plug in the Islamic Heritage Month resource guidebook. It's got over 500 items and definitely included your book and also Yusuf's documentary on the Rohingya. So thank you.
I think all of these history months are really great, but I also worry that things get too compartmentalized, that we can only talk about Black history in February and then the rest of the year it's not there, or Islamic history in, was it October? And while I think those are important moments to honor particular histories and groups, I think it's important to remember that that needs to be something, if we really want to disrupt the Eurocentrism, that has to be something that happens all the time and not just specific months out of the year.
Absolutely. So the next question is, why do you think Islamophobia is underreported, aside from the fear of reprisal, the strict parents, and the taboos that you mentioned?
I think it's with any kind of hate crime that they are always underreported. People are afraid. And I have to say that a lot of the issues that do get reported are not addressed, are not dealt with appropriately. They're, especially when it comes to hate speech, hate crimes, this sort of thing. Unfortunately, the threshold for the law when it comes to hate speech is very high. So you have situations where people are bringing forward concerns and those are not dealt with. You have people who are afraid of authorities and law enforcement simply because of their own experiences or negative experiences they've had here or elsewhere. So they don't want to bring those forward, or they, don't have faith in the system. And they may be afraid or embarrassed or ashamed also to bring out these issues. So there's a number of reasons why people are reticent to report what they experience. I remember it being bullied as a child and not really talking about it because you felt some sort of shame from it, even though you were the victim. So, that happens in ways as, in other ways as adults as well, where sometimes you don't want to rock the boat if you're a newcomer, you don't really understand the system or you don't trust it, or even if you do, sometimes you just feel like nothing may come of it, and that's fortunately something that happens.
Awesome, thank you. One of the questions here is, how can we ensure that Muslims and all other racialized students see themselves positively reflected in all public school classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've talked about some of that already in terms of representation and what that means, and that representation, should be, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking a lot about the formal curriculum. That's one thing. So what kind of storybooks, what kind of films are you showing, what kind of examples, what kind of current events, that's one thing. There's also something called the hidden curriculum. And that is the kind of messages that students get about themselves, often communicated silently through, their interactions with school authorities and things like that. And so when people hold and harbor their own biases, which is why, when we talk about anything to do with anti-oppression, it's sort of first starting with yourself and your own biases. I know people like to talk about something called an unconscious bias. I don't necessarily like that terminology because I feel like it absolves people from responsibility, but certainly there are ways that we have built up our own prejudices and we have built up our own ideas about people and particular groups. And so sometimes that can be communicated through this hidden curriculum where students start to get messages from school authorities about themselves and, whether they feel like they're being heard in a classroom, whether they feel like their experiences are being validated, whether they feel like their teacher is including them and they can see themselves reflected in what's happening. And so it's being attentive to both the formal and the hidden curriculum of schooling to begin to really deal with students holistically, not just what they're consuming, intellectually, but how are they actually feeling? Because, students and all learners bring their whole self into the classroom, their body, mind, spirit, having to leave part of yourself out of that experience is not conducive to learning, in a meaningful way. And so I think that is really important to ensuring that the classroom is a safe and inclusive space.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions together just because they kind of are around the same theme. So in case of being exposed to racism, what should someone do? And then what are the long-term solutions, like especially with respect to Bill 21, if you want to speak to that?
Sorry, what was the first question?
So the first one was about if you are confronted with Islamophobic,
right,
or experience Islamophobia, what's your advice to the person? And then what are some long-term solutions to stop discrimination, especially with respect to Bill 21?
Okay, thank you. Sorry. What do you do when you encounter Islam? I think there's things that, and if I'm speaking as a parent, right, I think that one of the things that needs to happen is to have those conversations with your children. And I know many parents do out of an abundance of caution because they're worried about their kids and what they might experience. So having those conversations at the dinner table, talking about, what they might be experiencing, and that, having open and honest dialogue about that, I think is important so that, kids can feel safe going to parents and knowing that what happened to them, their parents will be there to support them. And then for parents to sometimes know what to do. There's a certain amount of political literacy that people need to have to understand, how do I address this situation? If it happened at school, do I go to the teacher? Do I go to the school administrator? Do I talk to a school counselor? Understanding, the avenues of support that are available is part of the literacy that parents need to have to help their children address, the things that they're dealing with. I know for my immigrant parents, they wouldn't have had any idea, and which is why I rarely ever told them what was happening, what I was experiencing when I was growing up. They didn't know a lot of it. And so, because I knew that they wouldn't know how to address it either, right? So having, and it's been different with my own kids because of what I went through and because I grew up here. So I have more cultural capital and I'm able to help navigate situations. But even then I found it very difficult myself to, have to address these things. So, having conversations, being able to talk and seek advice from those you trust will help you to figure out, what you need to do if you encounter, is this a situation you need to call the, hate crimes? Is this a situation that can be dealt with another way? So it really depends on the kind of situation. As far as long-term issues, Bill 21, for those who don't know, is the bill in Quebec, which is called known as the secularism bill. And it is regulates what kind of religious symbols can be worn in the public sphere. And so what they call ostentatious religious symbols, like headscarves, for example, niqabs, or it could extend to other kinds of religious symbols that are overt, are not to be worn in the public sphere and civic spaces, or in people who are holding positions of authority like police or judges or teachers even, right? And so that is something that violates the Charter of Canadian Rights and Freedoms. And there are a couple of charter challenges to Bill 21. And I think, these are necessary, and those challenges have to happen, at a legal level. But it is part of a history of trying to ban and outlaw religious attire in Quebec, much as it has been done in other nations in Europe, for example. And so, I think that it's important that there are more advocacy groups that can challenge that at a legal level, that can challenge also look at the impacts of it. There is actually a study that just came out looking at the impact of Bill 21 on Muslim young people. And I mean, it just came out, I think, yesterday or the day before, but it reinforces what we already know, that, a lot of these young people, now we're talking about Muslim girls who wear hijab, are feeling that they have no future in the province because they won't get jobs if they wear the hijab. So they're forced to choose between participating fully in society or having fidelity to their faith. And that's not a choice that anyone should have to make. And it is a choice that's being imposed exclusively on Muslim women. And we would never sit back and allow the state or the province to determine, what women wear generally. If all of a sudden, the government was telling you you can't wear, certain type of clothing, there would be a mass sort of rebellion against this. Why should the state intervene in our sartorial choices and how we want to express ourselves? And yet this is precisely what's been happening in Quebec over decades. Bill 21 is the latest of many attempts to try and regulate Muslim women's attire and religious dress codes. And again, violates human rights and religious freedoms. So again, these are issues that are part of what we're dealing with when we talk about systemic forms of Islamophobia, how Islamophobia is expressed in policies and practices. And they need to be challenged and addressed, and there are people trying to do that. But it's another area where a lot more effort is required and a lot more resources are required in order to move that forward. But I know that there are efforts happening, and it won't be an easy solution. I think in the meantime, it's also dealing with and shedding more light on the negative implications of these policies and how they are affecting particularly young people who have to grow up in a society that won't recognize their freedom of religion.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna pass it over to Ketzer now, and he's gonna go with the next few questions.
Okay, so here's another question for you. A number of TDSB schools with Muslim majority populations don't have active parent councils. How can the TDSB specifically support Muslim parents from marginalized communities in Toronto to get involved in parent councils?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And, I gave that example earlier in terms of how can marginalized parents be included? And, I think like structurally, I'm not sure how it works within TDSB, how a parent council gets instituted in the first place. But if there is a parent council and they're finding that there isn't enough representation from marginalized parents, it's important to look at that and see, well, what are the barriers here? Are the barriers, the time we have meetings? Because, sometimes parents have 2 jobs or they work different shifts. Is it about that? Is it about language? Can we bring in interpreters? Is it other ways that they might not be feeling welcome or included? How do we reach out to those communities? And so those are kinds of things that, must be considered, because there's a lot of, when we talk about these barriers, they're not visible, they're invisible. They're sort of ways in which there are limitations for a lot of marginalized folks to, take part in school events or parent councils, and they may want to be, but they may not feel like they fit or that they belong. They may not feel that they may be newcomers and feel like they don't have anything to contribute. And so, you really have to look at, well, what are the barriers and what can we do to address those? And it may be working with other sectors of that community who have been here longer, who have more cultural capital, who can then reach out to those more marginalized sectors of the community and find ways to bring them into a more participatory and inclusive kind of advisory group. And so it does take, the effort, and it does involve looking at other resource people in those communities, other, specific community, ethno-specific community organizations who can maybe help facilitate. I know many, many years ago, I started an organization called Mentors, the Muslim Educational Network. And we actually had some funding from the government to run workshops for parents, who are newcomer parents, and actually helping them understand the education system, their role within it, how they could support their kids in schools here, and how they can be more active in parent councils. And so I remember that we did that work, a couple of decades ago, but I think maybe more programs like that need to be instituted, and more outreach to marginalized parents, because many of them would want to be involved, but may not feel that they can have a place there.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question here. What advice do you have for parents and families who are not Muslim, who would like to learn about cultural practices, beliefs, ways of knowing and being of racialized parents and caregivers, but are hesitant to ask?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. I mean, I think, often people, want to ask questions, they want to learn, but they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're afraid that, instead of making an honest inquiry, it might be misunderstood. It might be perceived as a microaggression. And so they're, and yet they have a sincere desire to want to learn more. And so that's where the question and the issues around allyship come in, is first sort of educating yourself. And I would admit too that it's difficult when it comes to learning more about Islam because of the plethora of misinformation that is available on the internet. So the question becomes, how do you find, the right kind of information? And that is not an easy thing if you're just out on your own, sort of surfing the internet. So I think that, to try and find that information, it's a good idea to, talk to, if there's a mosque in your community that, Muslim community organizations. And actually what's happening now is that a lot of these organizations are getting funds to do a lot of anti-Islamophobia work in schools. So they may be a good resource to go to get more information, more generally about Islam. I mentioned also in terms of Islamic culture, going to the Aga Khan Museum. They also have a bookstore there. Seeing what libraries have to offer. But, they're really, and maybe others know of a good website where people can find that kind of information, because I found it difficult. And, I spend a lot of time looking at Islamophobic narratives and in industries and people and the stuff they're putting out there, and then the lack of, easily accessible counter knowledge. And I think that is something that needs to be done. And so hopefully school boards have been proactive in maybe putting together some resources, maybe working with community organizations to put together those lists. I'm not aware of if that's happening, but I think those are some suggestions to get started.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I think we're giving you a lot of questions here. I hope you're okay, Dr. Zine.
Yeah, I'm fine.
The question is, why is it that the elected representatives, let me try that again. Why is it that the elected representatives also do not want to talk about Islamophobia? Do they fear backlash, or is it that they consider that it's not important?
So when we talk about politicians and, we have a long way to go in terms of really having issues that affect Muslims being dealt with effectively. in the government. Last summer there was a summit on a national summit on Islamophobia, which came in the aftermath of the horrific terror attack in London, Ontario. I was a speaker at that summit. And I mean, the extent to which there were, I believe, absolutely hundreds of recommendations that came from the community at this federal level about addressing Islamophobia. We haven't heard anything since then. So that was last July, I think. And we haven't heard anything in terms of, what will come of this. So there, I understand the frustration because, for example, now we have this National Day of Remembrance on January 29th. A National Day of Action on Islamophobia every January 29th in commemorating the Quebec mosque attack, but it took 4 years for that to happen. We're still not hearing, as I mentioned, what's happening from the recommendations of that summit that took place last July. There's been, I can talk about many instances where issues of Islamophobia were not taken seriously. So I think it is, if we want to be effective citizens, and we can be, bringing these issues to the concerns of your local MPs and MPPs. I have certainly done that in many cases and have gotten responses. I'm lucky to have someone who is very active around these issues. And so it's really looking for allies and finding, those politicians who will listen and supporting them and making sure that they are representing the concerns of their constituency, because that is their job. And so I really encourage people to, to be active in that sphere and bring your concerns to the table, whether it's to your school boards, whether it's to the municipal government, provincial, federal. We have to continue to make sure that these issues are on the table. If they're not even on the table, they won't be considered. Even if they're on the table, they may not be. But, if enough people start raising these concerns, then, we have a chance to have them addressed. But I agree that it's difficult sometimes to get these issues taken seriously, and it's an ongoing struggle. But unfortunately, with all of the terror attacks in this country, it's getting harder for various levels of government to ignore the issue of Islamophobia.
Okay, thank you. Another question: how can we move away from accommodation to something that is more normal, expected, what equity folks call inclusionary practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, accommodation is something that, is in the language of the Human Rights Code, and it refers to, having accommodations for religious practices. So there's policy on the creed and accommodation of religious practices, which I know TDSB actually has adopted as well, because I actually wrote the draft of it 20 years ago. I'm sure it's changed since then. But, and those are important to allow for diversity and inclusion at the same time. In other words, for people to be able to have their religious practices accommodated where possible within schools and other institutions. And yet, if we only look at inclusion as being a product of accommodations on a case-by-case basis, because in order to be accommodated, you need to request it. It's not necessarily a given. Although we are seeing more inclusionary practices. For example, I know at my university now we have not just designated prayer space, but also a wudu facility that's been built where Muslims can do their ritual ablutions before prayer. We're starting to see more, sort of structurally more of those kinds of, accommodations, if you will, brought in. But it needs to move beyond that sort of case by case and be part of a more inclusive culture. And so that requires all institutions to be able to examine their own practices and policies to make sure that they are ones that reflect an anti-oppression framework, right? And that's something I do quite a lot as a consultant, is work with organizations to look at their policies, to look at their practices, and to make sure that that those are aligned within an anti-oppression framework. And that involves also, more training and more understanding in order to make sure that institutions start to shift, and that shift isn't just window dressing. It's not just about putting the equity statement on the website. It's about transforming internally the cultures of those institutions to be more open and less oppressive. So I don't like so much the language of just equity, diversity, and inclusion. I prefer to speak in the language of anti-oppression, because that means addressing relations of power, relations of privilege, and starting to look at the kinds of racial hierarchies and other kinds of hierarchies that exist, and begin to dismantle those, right? As opposed to just have a model where, we are just looking at the accommodation, or we're looking at, a little more of a kind of window dressing type of inclusion, that we say the right things and we use the right words and we put the right things up on the website, but in the back end, nothing has changed, right? The systems and structures are still in place that are Eurocentric, or are still marginalizing to certain groups of people. So that begins with examining the practices, the policies that are in place, and really working towards making changes that are transformative throughout, an organization.
Awesome, thank you. This one is a little bit long, so I'll just read it slowly. Over time, Islamophobia has caused young Muslims especially to develop low self-esteem, mental instability, inferiority, poor academic performance, sectionalism, early detection of depression, among others. With this academic worthwhile research that you're embarking on, is your study providing novel plans for the House of Commons, the ministry in charge of educational system in Canada at all levels, and at all the school board levels, to be inculcated into the Canadian education curriculum as part of what should be taught, advocated, and integrated into the school board curriculum? So.
Wow, okay, thank you. That's a tall order. It's asking a lot of one book to do all of that. So, my research is, I'm a sociologist. My doctorate is in education. I've certainly done a lot of work on curriculum development, policy related to Islamophobia, both here and internationally. So there's many, many fronts that we have to, work on to address Islamophobia. So, one book isn't going to be a panacea or address all of the concerns that are important that were raised in that question. There has to be, it takes more than one book or one academic to do all of that. It really takes larger efforts that are concerted to put pressure on governments for change. So we need, effective lobbies. We need an effective advocacy group. And we need to have, more education within among teachers. I have a PhD student who's actually looking at the experiences of Muslim teacher candidates in their education programs. And that is going to provide some guidance to how, teacher training programs can be more inclusive to Muslim teacher candidates, for example. And there are research that's going on in different sectors. I'm doing some work now within the healthcare sector as well. There's so many fronts and so many areas that need attention. And so it's not really just the effort of one person, one book, or one study, but it is what we can start to look toward is making sure that governments and other bodies are providing the funding for this work and are allowing more research to happen that can start to inform the kind of changes that people are asking for. And we can't really ask for those changes unless we have the empirical evidence to show that this is a problem. And so that's where people like me come in to provide that empirical evidence and to then hand it over to communities and advocacy groups to begin to seek reform and change according to the kind of research that we've produced. And so I agree, it's something that has to happen in so many sectors, and education plays a key role. And I'm happy to see in the many years that I've been involved in Muslim community work that there is a lot of positive change happening. There's lots more initiatives happening around Islamophobia, a lot more awareness, a lot more excellent, teachers forums like this. So I think that, there is a lot of work to do, but I'm happy to see the gains that I've seen over the last 30 years, are really important in beginning to combat and challenge Islamophobia.
Excellent, thank you. And last two questions. So this one I have to ask because, it was asked also in the chat. Are you aware of culturally sensitive and trauma-informed counseling in schools? If not, what is needed to support counseling and counselors in schools?
I don't think I'm in a position to answer that. I do believe that culturally responsive and trauma-informed counseling is important. I know that that's something we've advocated for at the university level, so I'm not really aware of what's happening in school boards, but definitely that is, important to have for young people who are dealing with, so many different issues and concerns. Again, I see it very much at the university level. And that is something that we have pushed our institutions to make sure that it's not a cookie cutter approach to counseling, but that that the counseling service we provide will cater to the diversity of students that we have. And so I can't really say what is happening in, the TDSB or in school boards. So maybe somebody else could respond to that.
Okay, fabulous.
Before you move on, Naz, let me
Yes.
quickly take that one and say, yes, the TDSB through our professional services has been working really hard to do just the same, to ensure that our professional services, simplifying our social workers, our psychologists, our child and youth counselors, our child and youth workers are being trained, or if not, we are identifying appropriate partnerships who can come in and support us in that work to ensure that our students are getting what they need.
Awesome, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. And then this is the last question. So as you mentioned, Muslims are from many backgrounds: white, Black, Asian, South Asian, Latino, and so many more. How could we challenge Islamophobia from all angles?
Well, I think as much as I wanted to emphasize the diversity and the need for sort of an intersectional approach to Islamophobia, my study involved 130 participants from 23 or 26 different ethno-racial backgrounds. So that's right there showing you a cross-section of the diversity of Muslims. And I would have to say that, while I mentioned that Islamophobia is lived and experienced differently according to, people's, ethno-racial identities and how those are already attached to different kinds of racial formations and understandings, at the same time, there was far more in common that people had when it came to Islamophobia than the differences, right? So, there is a lot of commonality to the experiences, to the kind of marginality and alienation that Muslim youth are experiencing. And understanding those differences, has to do with listening to the diverse Muslim voices that are out there, how they articulate their struggles, what the differences are, but also not forgetting the commonalities, because we can become very fractured by our differences, right? And we can also, want to hierarchize those kinds of differences. And that is not conducive to any form of collective mobilization or action when it comes to dealing with oppression. And so I would say honor the voices of difference and learn from those particular experiences, but don't allow those differences to impede solidarity and the kind of cohesion that's required to address Islamophobia and other forms of racism that are very formidable and will only gain strength if we are divided.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to Michelle if you want to wrap up and I don't know, next steps. What's the next conversation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doctor. It's such a pleasure. I'm going to borrow from one of the participants in the Q&A who said this was thorough, informative, and grounded in facts and research. So it was so wonderful for you to share with us, our students and our young people's voice, to provide us a reality of what they're having to live with. And thank you so much for speaking to the idea of intersectionality, but also speaking highly to allyship and providing all our listeners with what steps they can now take to continue to build allyship. And I also love when you said it's really important that we do our own work, that we've got to begin by doing our own work, go out there, get some information. And so I want to say that we will provide some resources. We have dropped some resources in the chat. TDSB's Islamic Heritage Month created a great resource that's available to educators. I've also made it available to parents. So that's there for you. This talk will be posted and shared with our participants. So if you came in late, don't worry, you'll be able to watch it again. On that note, thank you for joining us for the conversation series. We want you to visit the TDSB conversation series page. We try to bring you very innovative speakers, dynamic speakers that we demonstrated today. So please watch out for our next session. We're hoping to do another one in late May and then another one in April. So please stay tuned. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks to Naz and to Kaiser for co-facilitating this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll echo in the chat, Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim members.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you,
Good
Dr.
night.
Zine. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks. And thank you, Margaret, for pulling it all together.
Always.
Always.
You're welcome.